I'm excited to pass on and head towards policy. I think we're going to stay in this realm of policy and harnessing the power of maths in policy making. Anne made so many fantastic points there in her keynote, but I think there is this idea of, beyond our sphere of maths, not just applications, but how we're doing this to shape society. We said at the top, socioeconomic implications of what we're doing. So we're going to delve into this a little bit more in a panel now chaired by Sir Andrew Dilnot, who is warden at Nuffield College in Oxford and an economist. So know something a little bit about policy making, perhaps. Andrew, over to you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks. Great to be here, everybody. We'll crack straight on. So this session is entitled Harnessing the Power of Maths and Data Science to Policy Making. We have three wonderful panellists who, if you were to caricature, would be a politician, so somebody representing the elected powers, those to whom we delegate decision making. So George, who's still an MP, has done many jobs, but probably the most relevant of all for us is the period that you spent as science minister a few years ago now, but also very interested in policy making. Then Julia Gog in the middle, who our caricature would be expert advisor. So, and most particularly, most recently, most prominently in the context of COVID, Julia, I think you're part of some of the SPY work, but also on SAGE, and has been through that whole experience. And then Pamela, who is no longer a civil servant, but for a long, long time was a civil servant, is under the caricature of civil servant, the person whose job it is under the SAGE, no pun intended, guidance of politicians like George to help politicians frame questions, think about possible policy approaches to them, and then implement them. So we're going to try and have a conversation, the three of us, and I very much hope the three of you will interrupt one another as well as me. We'll speak for, we'll have a conversation for maybe half an hour or so, and then we'll throw it open to you and really want you to...
Did you say politician interrupt?
No, I didn't mean that, obviously.
That's the thought.
Let me say something terrible. It says on the agenda that I've got a few minutes at the end to sum up, so I won't say very much now. The only thing I want to say to tee this up is I sometimes think that as a maths, data science community, I think we can be a bit shy. I mean, if you're making policy, it's impossible to imagine as a minister for anything, as an advisor in any area or as a civil servant in any area of our government, that data about what's going on, careful analysis of what might be done, and thought about how to implement and then assessment of it isn't absolutely the heart of everything that you do. And so I think one of the challenges that we face is getting out of a kind of corner where people might think it's a bit unusual to be a mathematician or data scientist. And what Anne has just said is a classic example of that. I mean, here's something unbelievably important to all of us. And of course it's full of mathematics and data, as well as language and other things. So I think part of the challenge for us all is to say, don't treat us as something a bit peculiar. Recognise that we're at the heart of everything. But we need to get out there as well. We need to be better at explaining to the wide public that we are indeed at the very heart. I want to try to divide this conversation not into three equal parts, but I think there are three big questions that I want to tackle. The first is an answer to the question I've kind of already answered, which is, well, do you really need mathematics and data to do this? But I think that's something we need to have good stories for. It's good for us to be able to. So that's one set of questions. A second set of questions is about barriers. Well, if it's really important, why isn't it happening already? And then the third set of questions is, so what are we going to do about it? What do we do next? So let's start off with, is it really? I mean, I know we all know the answer to this, but as I think we need some narrative for it. How is it important? Why is it important? George, let me start with you. Why is it important? Did it really matter to you when you were a minister?
Yes, and it should matter to every minister, every civil servant. I mean, firstly, just how wonderful that we're actually having this conversation, that we've got a maths manifesto. We've got a Prime Minister who gets maths, even though it's incredibly unpopular apparently with the electorate, but he's doing the right thing. And it's a joy to be here. And I just, in answer to that, I think it's not just a kind of empirical reductivist argument that you can't make good policy without a mathematician in the room, true though that obviously is. But I'd make a bigger point that if we are seriously going to harness the full power of science, research, technology and innovation for this country, that's both, yes, the science superpower mission that I've set out, tackling global challenges, attracting billions, driving recovery, but it's also bringing some science, some data science to the problems, the deep structural problems that we face, not least in the Treasury. I mean, it's always seemed to me, and this budget has revealed very clearly just how broke the Treasury model of managing growth is. It's not working. And the structural deficit is bigger than the Treasury's ability to respond to it. And if I was Chancellor, a bit like the captain of a battleship, I'd have two people either side of me. One, the growth person, and one, the public finances control person. And the tension in the Treasury should be between those two. But we've allowed the Treasury to become the Department of Financial Control. It's got oodles of numbers about how much money it has or hasn't given a department. But we're not properly analysing the lack of growth in different sectors of the economy all around the country. Department DCIT didn't have any data on private investment in science. So it's a bigger issue than just maths. We've somehow built an entire system of government that's based on a weird dance between sort of populist political sentiment from more or less, I mean, I think generally well-meaning politicians, and some of us with an empirical background, but basically a political instinct and a machine which is kind of wired to tell you that there's nothing wrong and that everything's fine and we've got the data to prove it. I mean, that is not a paradigm for a modern government to tackle the great, stubborn public policy challenges and go out into the world. Secondly, you would expect me to say this as a romantic. I believe that ultimately a society that hasn't got strong maths can't have strong logic, can't have strong philosophy, can't have strong arts. The reason the Enlightenment was an Enlightenment was that it brought it all together. And so I want to insist that maths is completely key to this country's ability to be a nation that can also stand for something in the world. And if we put it in too tight a silo, we undermine the virtue and quality and potential of maths, but also we siloize the way we think about it in public policy. And I mean, God, I could bore you for Britain, 14 years in 5 ministerial posts of how often, and by the way, I am so not a mathematician. Charlie Hastings, who dragged me through an O-level in maths, would attest to that. But you don't have to be a mathematician. You just have to be a decent MP and a decent minister to sit in a meeting and say, hang on a minute, what's the problem we're trying to solve? Could we frame it? Could we define it? How bad is it? I just come from a meeting of the Norfolk Mental Health Trust. Department of Health don't even know how bad it is because they haven't got a data set that tells you what comparative county mental health trusts look like. I don't want to know, are we an outlier? I mean, I just want a bell curve. Are we in the middle? Are we average? Are we out on either end? So there's a sort of culture, I think, in Westminster and Whitehall of sort of a lack of empirical understanding of and the power of analysing the problem properly. And if you can define the problem properly, you've got half a chance of getting the solution properly. And I come from a business background. You wouldn't go to a board meeting and have a set of numbers. I'm not an accountant. But unless we're all looking at the numbers going, hang on a minute, this company's going bust and it's got huge assets, let's restructure it. So I think it's a bigger problem, really. And I'll come to some detailed stuff on maths, but I think the real problem is a lack of people in Whitehall, Parliament and civil service asking the question, what is the problem? What evidence is there? What works? And if you can't put numbers around something, if you haven't got data, you can't manage it. Yeah. So we end up with lots of documents written in beautiful Oxford English, gathering dust on shelves and a government that looks busy and the problems don't get solved. Yeah.
I mean, Julia, so thank you, George, very much for that. It leads directly to the kind of the big shocks that we've experienced in the last 5 years, which is COVID. Mm-hmm. And one of the striking things about what happened after COVID was all of a sudden, lots of people wanted to hear about how mathematical biologists approached epidemiology, what the numbers were. What was good about how in demand you all became? And what was the worst feature of that as well?
Well, we didn't have to do anything to attract attention, to persuade the audience that what we were saying was relevant. Yeah. But the downside, you don't want your times to be too interesting, really, do you? Yeah. You don't want your disease modelers to be too busy. Yeah. I should say my experience with policy was largely limited to that emergency times. So I'm very different to, say, like the scientific advisor like Charlotte, who has a much longer link into government. My vision of it was just that very strange emergency times where it was totally fixed on, everything was fixed on one issue.
Yeah.
And from that, I can't imagine, I was trying to imagine before this, what would it look like to not have maths in that? I mean,
Exactly.
if you don't have maths in science advice during a pandemic, what is going on? What are you left with? So without maths, what do you have? You just have people making statements and opinions. Well, this would be a good strategy. What's the evidence for that? It is known. I mean, what do you do with that? With maths, and actually what Emily said in that first panel about the glue has really stuck. It can bring lots of things together. It means you can synthesize lots of evidence at a very high speed. I agree, it totally reduces groupthink and it allows challenge, right? So we can put forth a statement saying this is a good approach for something in COVID. You can say, well, what's your evidence? What are your assumptions? What have you modelled? Show us you're working. And robustness. Would you like an example of one situation?
I really would.
This is what you want.
We want your best example.
If you ask any of us who are on... The SPI-M was the modelling group, when we fed into SAGE, which then fed up to Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty and the Chief Scientific Advisors. Most interesting time was early 2021. So if you can think back to, say, New Year's 2021, Christmas has been the non-Christmas. You've got a real wish to unlock for so many reasons and get back to something like normal, get shops reopen, get restaurants, get kids back to school. Same time, you've got a pandemic still rolling, so you've got disease transmission. So you're balancing these two things.
And the vaccine's not yet rolled out to most
The
of the
vaccine
adult
is rolling
population.
out, starting just before Christmas 2020, but seriously through January, exactly through this period. And then in the middle of this, a new variant appears. So you're trying to optimise something where the context is changing partly in a way you know about and partly in a way you don't know about. I just can't think about how you do that without maths, and every mathematician in the room could probably immediately see there's lots of interesting and hard problems there. But to do that well, Charlotte said this as well, you've got to have this multiplicity of approach. You have lots of different groups taking different ideas, and you've got to have that, ability to have challenge between these different approaches. And SPI-M had that. We could have that challenge, but I would argue to have that, we were lucky in having a wide base of different modelling groups in the UK to start with. We could pull together lots of different ways of thinking. And I worry about that in mathematics and other settings. Are we going to continue to have this broad base in academe to draw upon?
Yeah, thank you. And Pamela, I'd love you to give us an answer to the first question. Are there some really good examples or indeed bad examples? But could you start as well, taking us on into why what seems to all of us blindingly bleeding obvious so often doesn't happen in the civil service? So why, and many of you will have had experience of this, you can talk to a civil servant, a senior civil servant in a policy area, and he or she simply won't understand the core data, point that George made, or you can talk to a senior civil servant working in an important policy area who feels completely ill at ease. He just doesn't feel at ease with mathematics, and so push that off to one side. So tell us some good or bad examples and help us think about why these barriers are there.
I'll try. And can I just say, as a fan of wordplay, I'm delighted to be in a room where you can make a pun on sage and everyone gets it. So essentially, decision makers, particularly senior decision makers, need to know two things. They need to know how important is this and how urgent is it. Because the only two things they can deploy, time and money, the only two things that are in their gift to deploy, relies on knowing importance and urgency so they can A, prioritise, and also B, evaluate whether decisions they've made in the past are working. Using numbers and data is the only way to be precise and specific, and that's the only way you can prioritise and evaluate. So let me give some examples from my time, not from COVID, but George will be familiar with this. The currency of government, the currency of giving advice to ministers is submissions. Who knows, or who is familiar with the concept of submissions? These are long-form prose papers. They're more digital now, but when I say digital, that is just the equivalent of turning a vellum into a PDF. They are essentially long-form documents. And they'll start with something that will say, there's an increased risk of outbreaks of violence in prisons. More schools are reliant on teaching assistants. There are 10% more victims of crime in the country, so we need to increase the Office of the Victim Commissioner's budget by 10%. Okay, 144 prisons in the UK. Are 72 of them more at risk of violence, more at risk than last month, than last year, than the early 90s? We've got more teacher assistants and teaching assistants in our 28,000 schools per pupil, per class. Have we got any sense that the Office of the Victims Commissioner is not responding to failure demand in this 10% of victims approaching? You know, all of these things, and I know it's not maths in the context that this room understands it, but it's confidence with using numbers. And the skill that I think is most lacking in the writing of advice to ministers or the producing of advice to ministers, and writing is just thinking in ink, isn't it? It's just being able to make an argument, is being able to write with using numbers, write prose with data. John Lanchester's got that skill, Ben Goldacre's got that skill, the ability to be able to sort of trespass across your domain and interpret it for somebody who's not of your domain is like gold dust. And the people that do it are brilliant because they can make an argument with precision and specificity. And just to go on to your second point, Andrew, sorry, I've got a lot of different examples, but I know we're having a longer conversation. It is getting better, but I still think that CP Snow essay, you know, the two cultures applies. It is okay, getting less okay, but it's okay as a senior leader in the civil service to say, oh, I'm not really a numbers person, in the way, and that's not shameful or career limiting. If you said I'm not really a words person, that would be shameful and career limiting. You know, yes, it's less and less, and it's less and less after COVID, but it's still the case that it's okay not to have a basic level of numeracy that's a standard we need for the challenges we face. And I think that ability to have that across all the people who are writing prose submissions would raise the bar quite considerably.
Hear, hear.
So, George, what can... you know, we live in a world where... So I can remember a conversation with a permanent secretary of one of the two largest spending departments in the UK who said to me that she or he really wasn't very good with numbers like the overall budget for the department. And this is in the last 15 years, and you think, well... but we live in a country where in the last 25 years we've had a Chancellor of the Exchequer who's actually arguably the cleverest Chancellor of the Exchequer in that period, say that he wasn't very good with numbers, which was simultaneously not true, because actually he was very good with numbers, and terrifying. What on earth? Can you be part of that cultural transformation? You as in politicians? How do we tackle that?
Yeah, well, ultimately politicians are responsible for everything. That's the point. So we have to take responsibility, and I'm fond of saying that we get the journalism we deserve, and I think politics as an activity for 20 years has downgraded its relationship with journalism. We've spun, spivved, turned interviews into vox pops, and guess what? So it's ultimately the political class's responsibility, I think. I think the civil service has a responsibility as well. But if ministers ask the right questions, if ministers say, I do not want 50 pages of beautiful Oxford classical prose, I want 5 pages that describes the problem, describes what's... So if ministers ask the right questions, I think it helps. Ultimately, that'll drive the machine. I think there's... the reason I talk about the Treasury is, in the end, departments are civil servants are very loyal to their department. They're more loyal to their department than politicians are to their party, I would suggest, actually. I wear my conservatism as a loose linen suit, not a straitjacket. But most civil servants I know, they're very loyal to their department. And not blindly, but very. And there's nothing more dysfunctional in my experience than the Comprehensive Spending Review, where the Treasury rises above Whitehall, pits every department against each other, plays them all off against each other, completely undermining any proper serious consideration of interdepartmental cross-government work, which is Minister for Life Science, which was business and health, was completely key. And you end up with a sort of weirdly infantilizing power politics that comes to a star chamber of politicians who's more powerful. I dream of a CSR in which we'd have some data. What did the departments do with the money we gave them last time? And you could start to go, well, this department have delivered shock horror more with less. And by the way, you then have to not give them less. You need to say, well, they're obviously doing something right. Let's give them more and let's see. So, I mean, just in the end, I think this is about a culture of how we want to run our public administration. And that is, it's up to the political class. I think it is also up to the civil service together. When I persuaded Philip Hammond that we should set up a leadership academy for public sector leaders, having come from the private sector, it's often asserted, what we need is private sector leadership. I beg to differ. Quite a lot of private sector leaders I know are terrible. Very few deal with the complexity of public administration. A district council chief executive is dealing with about 40 different statutory responsibilities in about 60 acts of parliament. I mean, no private sector leader I know could. So we set up that leadership academy, and one of the things I was trying to do was to get some data science in to help. So as you rise up, whether it's in the police service or local government, you start to get a handle on how you can use data better. But I think in the end, yes, we need more mathematicians everywhere, but I think in the end this is a problem of the political and administrative class fetishizing well-written prose, long documents, and well, Minister, if you'd like, I could give you both sides and the third side of this argument, and ministers enjoying it. We need impatient ministers who say, I don't want all, I just want to know the facts. If we can get that culture, I think maths would flourish better in administration.
Can I give an example?
Yeah, please do.
So really quickly, a couple of years, many of you have heard me use this example before. A couple of years ago, the analytical profession in government did a survey, an anonymous survey of the policy profession in government. And just to, for those who are unfamiliar with Whitehall, the most of the people around ministers will be part of the policy profession. It's a sort of catch-all term. And it included questions like, how comfortable are you with the difference between causation and correlation, all those sorts of things. One of the questions was, could you explain the difference between a percentage increase and a percentage point increase? 31% of those responding to the survey said they couldn't. Now that is material, but what I love about it in terms of the civil service is it was an anonymous survey, so rather than just Google it or lie, bless them, they sat there going, yeah, no idea. But that's what we're talking about. That is bad. That means that however many checks there are in that bit of submission going to the minister, those people should not be writing advice to ministers.
There's a moment after I want to hear something particularly that I want to put to Julia. I'll tell you another story about an anonymous survey of civil servants. But Julia, you're the only one here who's a serving academic on this panel, who's a serving academic in this space. Part of what feels as though it's gone wrong here is maths caught up in something of a culture of anti-intellectualism. Mm-hmm. What do you think your students and your both undergraduates, doctoral students, postdocs, young academics, do they feel as though what they're doing, do they feel good about themselves, or do they have a sense of being slightly in a corner and slightly apologetic about being mathematicians? A quick anecdote. A friend, somebody who many of you will probably know, I won't give his name, who in the early 1980s was doing a doctorate in modelling the way that genetic mutation worked. And he was extremely smart, articulate, and very good-looking bloke. I hated him. But he found that at parties, people would ask him what he did, and he said, well, I'm a kind of mathematical statistician. And by the time you got to the end of statistician, they'd be looking over his shoulder to see if they could find something. And he changed his line to, I model genes, which was... So do you feel as though your people feel as though they're modelling genes or they're mathematical statisticians?
I'm looking forward to the time someone asks me what I do for a living, and it's no longer interesting. I just don't mention pandemics. It's fine. Yeah. Thinking about the students, I mean, the postgraduates are an interesting crowd. Bear in mind, they've started to do their PhDs, so we're talking about PhD students in the last few years. The students most of us have chosen to do this field because they saw its practical value, that it could be interesting on the academic side, but also have this real-world implication. So the students we're dealing with now are not shy about this. Indeed, they're driven by it. And I think that's true also. I think we've got some graduate students here in maths for deep learning and climate sciences. It's the same. It's understanding the importance of this combined with it's mathematically interesting too. You've got to have both. Yeah. The undergraduates, I don't think they're apologetic at all. I think some of them haven't thought yet about where it's all going. They're just into their subjects. They're into their subject. Some have, and they've started to see it's so visible where maths fits into the world now and that more is needed. So definitely not.
Good. Well, that's very encouraging.
I've just had a terrible thought. I think I finally found something I agree with Dominic Cummings about, which is maths.
Yeah.
And to be fair, he's been a very outspoken advocate of data science and maths and empiricism in government. And I do think, I mean, you asked me what do I do about it. I think one of the things would be in our education system is you go through A-levels and you start to split into arts and science. I mean, scientists need to be taught and trained and helped to present an argument on their feet. And art students need to be taught to recognise, understand, respect, and be able to use some sort of empirical evidence in constructing an argument. We're not doing anyone any favours in that very CP Snowish separation.
Yeah, very good. And I want to ask Pamela and Julia that same question. What would you do? We've got 3 minutes left before I want to throw this open. What should we do next? How might we make things better? I mean, Pamela, you're COO for a newish organisation called Civic Future. Is mathematics, statistical training going to be a part of what you're trying to pump into these young people?
Well, funny you should ask, because this Friday I've got 30 people coming to where we're based in Public Hall in Westminster for an Economics for Government 101. Also, it draws on the masterclass that we did together, Andrew. And it is just that it's people who have in some way committed to, and some of them who helped test it are in this room. Thank you, David. People who have in some way committed to public life, whether that's civil service or politics or public sector leadership in some way, who are just conscious that they're not economists. They're never going to be economists, but they need to know the public finances. They need to know how money moves through the systems. They need to be comfortable explaining supply side and demand side interventions. So that's what we've developed, and that's just one of the things that tries and intervenes at a sort of but further stage career. But the Civic Future flagship is an early, unashamedly early intervention, quite intensive in first or second job to be done alongside a full-time job, which equips you with knowledge, skills, networks of all the things that are going to be useful for you in whatever public life role you might take. And one of the things we recruit for, or one of the things we assess for, is aptitude for maths and science. And I like you, I'm pretty confident the young people that we see coming through are not embarrassed at all about being interested in maths, interested in data. In fact, I almost think, and I was toying about whether to say this or not, because I think we've got a long way to go to address the CP Snow thing first. I'm a former colleague, fan, and neighbour of Dom, as well as a big critic. He is right about maths. He's right about maths circles, and the King's maths school is a joy, and that was him just driving it through in the department. But one of the things, and again, I have said this to his face, is that humanities people slightly need to watch out for putting the maths and the science on a pedestal, because they're a bit embarrassed about their PPE degree or their classics degree, and they're thinking, well, the objective truth is in these guys. These are the geniuses. And I saw that you'll be able to speak more about it. But I saw that a bit during COVID and Brexit, that there was this get the data person into the room, get the maths in the room. Please tell us the truth. And as someone who is confident in their mathematical skills and confident in their mathematical skills will know that there is a big tolerance. There is a big standard deviation in the advice that they're giving as well. So there is no such thing as the science.
I think you touch on another point, which is I remember in the pandemic thinking, finally, I wouldn't have wanted this to be the reason, but finally we're going to have to confront this. We're going to have to put science, empiricism, data right at the heart of the national emergency. It's like a Battle of Britain of science. I was at the first COBRA meeting. The Prime Minister famously wasn't there. It was a sort of get every department to think about it. We were shown the data. 400,000 deaths predicted. And I remember thinking then, we need to make very clear that in the end, politicians are going to have to make some very, very difficult judgments based on the best advice. And I think we rushed, well, I wasn't in government anymore, but I think the political class rushed saying, oh, we'll just follow the science, follow the science, follow the science. In the end, we abnegated responsibility, and we should have said, we're very lucky to have these incredible data scientists, but our job on your behalf is to take some tough decisions, and they will be judgments, and we are bound to get some wrong, but we'll do our best. Mm-hmm. And I think if only the COVID inquiry was more interested in the lessons than who texted Matt Hancock which evening, we could actually learn some big lessons about data science.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Julia, if you had a magic wand, is there one thing you'd do to try to improve this?
Yeah, it's simple. My point of view is very much from what we can do from the academe side, what's in our control. Simple thing would be communications of mathematics. Yeah. It was very clear that I've got one language as a Cambridge professor, which is for my students and my colleagues. And then I'm trying to communicate to government, the Secretariat from SPI-M, from SADIA, the civil servants, and realise some of what we say is not making sense at all. Earlier in the pandemic, I wrote a couple of one-pagers of just explaining concepts, and there's one, if you actually dig around, you'll find that the Secretariat changed the title on the paper, but not on the PDF. So there's a document called Doubling Time for Classicists in there, and then that's what I realised we needed to do. That's part of our job, to be able to explain some of these concepts. You know, not every here's the things you need to know. And then also, once you start to do that, it gets back to the barriers, you'll start to be able to have people come back and say, look, you guys all mentioned this in the modelling. What does this even mean? And we need to be able to explain. So the maths communications from our side, I think we can do a lot more with. Yeah.
Very good. Wonderful. Well, thank you. But don't go away, because we've now got some time for some conversation. You're all going to get a moment to think about what it is that you want to ask, because I'm going to turn first to Nigel Campbell, who is the chair of the new National Academy for Mathematical Sciences. Nigel, to make sure everybody here knows a bit about what the Academy is there for, and B, any reflections you have on what you've heard. Nigel.
I haven't got a microphone, but nobody normally says I'm quiet. So what we're here for is exactly what we've heard, to represent, to be part of, maybe I am too quiet, to represent the community, and I mean the whole community, and I mean education, academia, the people who work in industry and government, and I mean whole of the UK, and I mean all parts of the mathematical sciences. And one of the things is we should really get much better at implementing policy. If I think of another science, and Andrew is your world-class expert here on economics, the economists in government, very numerous, only 50-something years of practice in the government economic service, still think they don't have enough influence. I could point to several permanent secretaries who call themselves economists, but that's what they did in the point. And they're still economists. Whereas I had lots of people come up to me and say, well, I'm not really a mathematician because I'm a statistician, operational researcher, or I used to do it. But I'm not quite as brilliant as that field's medalist. Hang on. Once a mathematician, once a mathematical scientist, always. Treat ourselves like the economists. The economists don't have as much influence as they should have. But they have a heck of a lot more than we do. And I say this as someone who started as a statistician in government, became an economist, became a policy advisor, came back to economics, and then finished most of the last time doing maths. And I've got lots of counterexamples where people listened, and you get in the room and you get a really decent minister, I call him a Ledwin, who only wants to know the facts. A bunch of people who want to know the story, the line to take. What's the story? Oh, well, it's better than since 2010, etc. There is an important sort of semi-respectable job, which is giving ministers, parliamentarians, something to say the government's doing a good job. There are some numbers underpinning that. There is also a very important job finding what is really going on. Because after all, you can't fix a problem without knowing what the problem is. The number of people who mix those two things up, or things, let's say, and if I have one wish, every time that goes into someone's mind, it would dissipate. So, no, I've got two tasks here. Know my best story, but know what's really going on. A little plug. I hope the Academy will help with policy. I hope the Academy will help in putting people in government in touch with people who are experts in the field. Let's do that. We'll need to talk to lots of people in innovation. There's lots of other things in the manifesto for which Kathy and a load of people need credit. This is something that the mathematical sciences community, all your representatives, have agreed. There's 7 organisations up there, and you can see where the words are haggled over. Frankly, we've got a document that everybody signs up to, the Communities Manifesto, and we'll use it for the UK general election and beyond, whoever wins. Oh, by the way, there's these elections in the country of my parents first, Scotland and in Wales and Northern Ireland. We'll have another one of those to put on it too. So that's what I hope the Maths Academy will do. And I hope that the chances dictates in terms, I've got counter arguments, but I've got so many examples of terrible behaviour where people are so keen that, I've got this new information. It's a bit inconsistent with what I've been saying to the minister. Can we change the else to enlist? No. Better. But I've also got examples where it absolutely drove. There was a major problem. It was a national crisis. It was found illegal in the High Court. I'd better not mention it. And the way it got solved, the way we solved it was, let's really understand each stage of it, and then let's go and deal with each level. And there are a series of things, each of which, how on earth did we end up here? But the more important question was, what can we do about it? And it's only numbers that solved it. And other questions, like climate change, you need much more complicated math than that. And then finally, how lots of people are driven by a sense of purpose, including everyone in this room, and including, I bet, every one of Julia's and everybody else's students. Well, one of the Stanford Britain Awards winners was a mathematician whose class was making cancer treatment safer using mathematics. Well, so if we haven't just got climate change, the most important challenge in our history, factors quite important too, doesn't it? Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys. Okay, questions from, so I see a question here. Anybody else could raise your hand now so I can catch up for later. Wonderful, thank you. Go ahead.
Should senior civil servants have to pass a maths test to become a senior civil servant? And should ministers have to pass a maths test to be a minister?
I'm a George. Yeah. Okay, I think let's take this one, then we'll take some more. But yeah, take George.
I don't think a maths test, but I think a problem-focused test. When I was first elected, I went around every public agency in my constituency and I said, simple question, pie chart, money in, money out. Can you just tell me roughly, broadly where it goes? That doesn't make you a mathematician. It makes you an inquiry, an interest in mind. You start out and you can like leaders of public services do not.
I don't know, how many?
So I'm pro-exams, as you know. Not for ministers, actually, but for civil servants. You are familiar with the scientist Stanley Willingham, David. Knowledge precedes skills. We understand things in context of things we already know. Proficiency requires practice. You internalise knowledge, and that makes you better able to. That's why we all learn how to take timetables at school. It is bizarre that it is expecting of senior civil servants to internalise quite complex and sort of, dubious, and that's not just my view, it's a view of replication trials and social justice theories, or certainly, but they haven't internalized basic facts about the average wage in the country. The expectation needs to be that you've internalize some knowledge, and I'm afraid, as Ian Waldridge argues brilliantly in his end of assessment of meritocracy, but we know tests are perfect, but I do help you internalize some knowledge. So I'm pro-exams for civil service. I'm not so pro-it for MPs and politicians. We have a representative democracy. That's not what they're there for. So I'm not sure about having a sort of another technocratic layer. I think the key is they need the ability to trust us across disciplines. They need to have good life experience. They need to know how to ask the right questions. But I think the most important thing to do is have, if we're going to keep the system we've got, an absolute expert permanent civil service.
Julia, did you find people that you interacted with through COVID on the whole were able to grasp what you were saying for me? Put it well?
Yeah, and of course I was not dealing with a random sample of civil service. I mean, the maths PhDs and STEM PhDs were shunted our way. But it did take a little while to get through that culture of them not understanding what I was saying, and vice versa. I mean, just languages, cultures. But if there's one thing I can change quickly, it would be not a maths test, but less fear of math, more willingness to engage with it and say, excuse me, what do you even mean by that modulus? Just explain that properly for me. That would be the easiest way.
Fair, thanks. There was a question, pause back here, then we'll go here. So we'll take these two together. So that question and then Thank you. You spoke about data informing policy, but I wonder whether that's enough. Should we be thinking more about policy for data and collecting data in a form that can be used? So the data generated process is important. We need to spend a lot more time thinking about data collection, getting mathematicians as statisticians holding that. Brendan, thank you. And then we'll take this another question just here. 2 rows in front at the end of the row. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm interested, how much do you think the problem of maths not being harnessed is exacerbated by the fact that often, policies are published without the evidence behind them and the justification? We have a code of statistics, we have Treasury Green Books, we have a code of practice, but in reality, often policies are published with statements and claims where we can't really see, where the data's come from, and hence the public can't engage with it, experts can't respond to it.
Yeah. Okay, so 2 somewhat different but clearly related questions. One, do we need to think much harder about data we collect? And critically, I think its availability, and maybe in Jimmy's got something to say about some of that, because I suspect Kevin might carry. And secondly, would we have a better discipline on policy if policy pronouncements actually have to have some evidence associated with it? So I'm going to go to Julia first, George for the second, then Pamela for any reflections on either. Julia.
Thank you. I've got a lot to say about policy for data, funnily enough, and I think any disease modeller that you tackle will have lots of stories. Inquiry, if you dig down the detail of what we put there, it will show you some of the horror stories of missed things with the data and happened. To summarise it in a sort of 30 seconds here would be a good way of doing it. The COVID-19 dashboard. It's flipping brilliant, right? You can go into it, and it was public, it was open, which actually starts to answer the second question. We could point to open data sources and say, look, this is you can run our code, you can use this data here. So one of the barriers to data was not the data existing, but it was who had access to it. And when there's massive legal things individual academics would have to tackle with their universities, COVID-19 dashboard would bypass that. So everything is open. Also opens up who can work on it as well. It's not just a few people have access. And it also means that policies can be challenged if you can show where the data's come from.
George, policy actually working? Yeah, 2 great questions, and they're the flip side of each other, aren't they? I'd start with policy without data, to me, is pretty meaningless. I mean, you can take a policy position. Any policy paper I was signing off, I want to know, well, what is the KPI, what's the data outcome that we could measure to work out whether this policy has worked? It doesn't need to be a hugely complex algorithm. It can just be a red app every, what's the metric? And if you haven't got it, and you haven't a year later got a report back, it'll just gather dust on the shelf. And on policy for data, completely right. I mean, my background is biomedical research and life science healthcare, but couldn't even begin to do it properly without data. And guess what? The NHS isn't collecting the right data properly, and it's not flowing it properly. It goes much more broadly across government, and I think we could build into the Select Committee network thinking about solutions. Government Whitehall is obsessed with Treasury data, most of which is pretty semi-detached in terms of its portrayal of what the problem is. We're really bad in Whitehall at data science, and I think there is something we can do. I hope it's in the manifesto, I should read it, to insist that whichever party, we want to make sure we're collecting the right data to make policy better.
I'll try to answer to both those excellent questions as well. So in terms of, yes, we're a bit wary in when something comes acronym or becomes capitalized, because once it's reified like that, people stop engaging their brains. So that, and that's why it's data-driven. So data-driven, it's not data-driven. What are you talking about? Do you mean descriptive data? Do you mean diagnostic data? Do you mean predictive data? Do you mean prescriptive data? So, the analysis and the use of that data is what's interesting. We are actually, we're slightly overwhelmed with data in government. And when I go back to my first answer, the beginning of the submission will have these general sweeping phrases, but in the annexes A to H, and I'm not joking, there'll be tables and tables and tables of data. So we need more people who can apply analytical skills and descriptive skills to the data we have and use it well. And to do that, answer to the second question, I'm for radical transparency. So you mentioned policies are published without we're not showing our work in good maths exam technique. It will be there somewhere. Publishing everything that the government has in a form, Tableau or something that an armchair enthusiast can manipulate and apply their own models to. I think there are we heard of them earlier. Clearly, there are some data sets from GCHQ that you wouldn't want to do that with. I think the default assumption should be that most of what the departments are dealing with, that they're very protected and weird about, is kind of fine. And there might be a few news stories that weekend once you publish it, and just get it out there really quickly.
No one's asked me the question about Michael Gove and experts, but I'm happy to answer it if you want me to. But my answer to it is tiger-like in defence of him, because what he was actually saying in answer to Faisal Islam was beware of the organisations like the CBI and the FSB and all these organisations who aren't experts, by the way, and have got things wrong in the past, because my experience of him as a minister was craving expertise. One of the things he did, in education, he had Ben Goldacre and Roger Plant do an analytical review and then get more evidence into education. In the Ministry of Justice, he set up the Data Evidence and Science Board as his first act in the department. One of the products of that was the Crown Court Information Tool. Google it, you'll be able to find it somewhere. It's a joy. It's got this, again, Tableau form. It's got every single Crown Court in the country and every single bit of data you could possibly want. How many cracked trials, volume crime, all of those things. But it's just sitting there. The policy people in the MOJ probably don't even know it's there anymore. You could test so many interesting hypotheses about why Derby's got more, cracked trials than Birmingham, or whatever it might be, and it just shows the agony of trying to get the judges to let us publish that. But it just shows that when you put that data out there, the sky doesn't fall down, and actually people can use it to test the policies that are then published. Sorry,
Good.
that was longer than
No, we should stop, because I can see that the national there isn't a more important person in this country than the national statistician, and that's not just an ad hominem reference to Ian Diamond. It's but Ian is due on next, and so we should pass on to that. I'm extraordinarily grateful to George and to Julia and Pamela. These are really critical issues. They're incredibly critical, and they're not just important to us. They're important to the 70 million people who live in this country and the 7 billion people who live in the world. And we, in my own judgment, we still have an absolute mountain to climb. We are nowhere in the culture war here. We're still in a strange culture where many, many people in Whitehall and Westminster simultaneously think they're not good at it, and that it doesn't matter that they're not good at it. And this is unbelievably bad. And my own general diagnosis, this has come up a few times here today with very wise comments, I thought, from all three of our panellists, emphasising that there is not some clear discontinuity between mathematics or numbers and other forms of communication. These are all forms of communication. The idea that there's words and numbers is so intellectually incoherent as to be almost staggering. These are all languages. Okay? We're not very good at making some of the language that we use accessible to others, and many of the people who need to access it are terrified by it. They're wrong, but we've got to help them. And at least a large part of the solution has to be in our hands. We have to do better. We have to try to get thinner glasses, be less spotty.
Better genes.
Better genes, yeah, better genes. We need better genes. We need somehow to be cool. On that happy note, exemplifying all of that, let's turn to Ian Diamond, our national statistician, who is on next. Thank you very much.